Have you ever stopped to think about why? Even though we are living in the most prosperous period in human history, so many people around you seem more distressed than ever. Why? In an era where we have instant access to any information, connection with people worldwide, and opportunities our ancestors never dreamed of, is there this growing sense of emptiness, that something fundamental is missing? Perhaps you feel this yourself, that silent restlessness that emerges when digital distractions stop for a moment, and you wonder if you're truly living or just existing on autopilot. You're not alone in this experience, and what you're feeling might be the first sign of something much larger approaching. Imagine for a moment the life of a medieval peasant. He walked with the sun, worked the land, his father and grandfather had worked, knew exactly what his place in the world was, which God to believe in, whom to marry, when to plant and when to harvest. His life was difficult, certainly marked by scarcity, disease, and early death. But there was something that peasant possessed that we, with all our technology and abundance, have almost completely lost. Absolute certainty about who he was, what his purpose was, and what life expected of him. Every gesture had meaning, every season brought known rituals, every relationship was embedded in a stable social network that had been tested for generations. He might die young, but he knew exactly why he was alive. Now compare this with the experience of a young adult in 2024. He has access to more information than any emperor in history, can instantly communicate with people on distant continents, has career opportunities that didn't exist a decade ago, but every morning he needs to construct his identity from scratch. Decide what to believe among thousands of digital influencers, choose among hundreds of career options that might become obsolete before he even graduates, navigate liquid relationships, where even the concept of romantic love is constantly being redefined. He might live to 90, but spends most of his time wondering what the point is of living so long. This is the great transformation of our time, and it's creating the ground for a completely new crisis. While economists and politicians prepare for possible financial collapses, recessions, or trade wars, the real storm approaching won't be measured in GDP or stock indices. It will be measured in rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, and a completely new form of human suffering we're still learning to name: collective existential crisis. For centuries, humanity organized its societies around grand narratives that gave meaning to both individual suffering and collective progress. Religion promised that earthly suffering would be compensated in eternal life. Nationalism suggested that personal sacrifices served the glory of the homeland. Socialism guaranteed that present difficulties were building a utopian future for all. Even capitalism offered its own version of meaning. Work hard, be successful, consume, and you'll find happiness through material progress. But what happens when all these narratives begin to crumble simultaneously? When religion loses relevance for large urban populations, when nationalism reveals itself as an artificial construction that serves more to manipulate than to unite, when socialism fails in its utopian promises, and when capitalism itself begins to produce more anxiety than satisfaction, what remains is an entire generation of human beings who are highly educated, technologically connected, and materially comfortable, but completely lost about what to do with their lives. This isn't a crisis that can be solved with economic policies or institutional reforms. It's a crisis of meaning, and it's deepening every year. Statistics already show the signs. Rising depression rates among young people who theoretically have everything to be happy about. Anxiety epidemics in prosperous countries. Suicide records among populations with high education and income levels. But this is just the beginning. Technology, which was supposed to liberate us, is accelerating this crisis in ways we've barely begun to understand. Every algorithm that personalizes our digital experience isolates us a little more in our own reality bubble. Every screen-mediated interaction reduces our capacity to form genuine human connections. Every notification that interrupts our focus fragments our capacity for deep contemplation and self-knowledge a little more. We are creating tools too powerful for our current emotional wisdom. Think about the paradox we live in. We have apps that promise to connect us with anyone in the world, but record levels of loneliness. We have access to humanity's entire library in the palm of our hand, but our capacity for concentration is dramatically diminishing. We have medications that can chemically treat depression, but the existential causes of that depression are multiplying faster than our ability to medicalize them. And here lies the true danger of the 2026 crisis. It won't have simple technical solutions. When an economy collapses, we know what to do. We can print money, lower interest rates, create employment programs, restructure debt. When a war threatens international order, we can mobilize armies, form alliances, negotiate treaties. But what do we do when millions of people simultaneously lose the capacity to find meaning in their lives? The answer isn't in more technology, more efficiency, or more economic growth. It might be, paradoxically, in learning to slow down in an era that forces us to constantly accelerate. It might be in rediscovering forms of human connection that don't depend on digital mediation. It might be in creating new rituals and traditions that offer the kind of emotional stability that old institutions used to provide. But perhaps, more importantly still, the solution might be in accepting that we don't need to have all the answers about the meaning of life to live meaningful lives. The medieval peasant had certainties that were largely illusory, built on myths and traditions that wouldn't withstand modern scientific scrutiny. We have doubts that are paradoxically closer to the truth about the complexity of human existence. The emotional crisis approaching might actually be a disguised opportunity, a chance to build a way of living that's more honest about the limitations of human knowledge, more compassionate toward the suffering inherent in existence, and more creative in seeking forms of meaning that don't depend on absolute certainties or promises of permanent happiness. Let me pause for a moment to ask, do you recognize in your own life this constant search for meaning in a world that seems to offer fewer and fewer reliable narratives about how to live? This feeling that despite all the available opportunities, something essential is missing in our collective experience? If these reflections touch on questions you've been carrying, perhaps in silence, know that you're far from alone in this restlessness. Share in the comments. I feel our era lost meaning when your experience might offer valuable insights to others facing the same existential questions, and together we can begin to map the contours of this new crisis before it catches us completely unprepared. Looking toward 2026, we shouldn't expect the symptoms of this emotional crisis to manifest in an organized or predictable way. They might appear as waves of protests that can't clearly articulate their demands, populist political movements that promise simple answers to complex questions, or even as completely new forms of art and culture that express the anguish of a generation lost between worlds. The crucial difference is that this time we'll have the opportunity to face a crisis knowing it's coming. We don't need to wait for millions of people to emotionally collapse before we begin developing psychological resilience, support communities, and sustainable ways of finding purpose. We don't need to wait for traditional institutions to completely collapse before we begin experimenting with new forms of social organization that place emotional well-being at the center of their priorities. Perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that this crisis isn't a sign of humanity's failure, but of success. For the first time in history, we've solved basic survival problems for a significant percentage of the world's population. Now we're free to face deeper questions about what it means to be human, how to find meaning in finite existence, and how to build societies that nourish not just our bodies, but our souls. The emotional crisis of 2026 might be the painful birth of a new phase of human civilization. A phase where we finally learn to integrate our incredible technological capacity with emotional and spiritual wisdom adequate to the complexity of the challenges we've created for ourselves. But this will only happen if we start now the conversation about how we want to live, not just how we want to produce, consume, or compete. If you feel these reflections touched on something important about the challenges we face, both individually and as a society, I invite you to be part of this ongoing discussion. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a community of people who, like you, are seeking to wisely navigate through these extraordinary transformations we're experiencing. We don't offer easy answers, because life's most important questions rarely have simple solutions. But we offer a space to explore these essential questions together, collectively building more conscious and compassionate ways of living in this complex and fascinating world we're creating. The crisis is coming, but for the first time in history, we have the possibility of facing it consciously, prepared and united by a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human in an era of accelerated transformation. The issue is that we're living what we could call the Great Emotional Acceleration. While our ancestors had decades to process significant social changes, we face fundamental transformations in how we work, relate, and understand reality every few years. The human nervous system, which evolved to deal with immediate physical threats and stable communities of a few dozen people, is being constantly bombarded by stimuli for which we have no evolutionary preparation. Consider, for example, what it means for a 20-year-old to choose a career today. He's not just choosing a profession, he's betting on what type of human skill will still be valued in an increasingly automated economy. He needs to anticipate which industries will exist in a decade, which competencies artificial intelligence won't be able to replicate, and how to position himself in a job market that could be completely reorganized by technologies that haven't even been invented yet. This isn't just economic pressure, it's constant existential pressure. And this happens simultaneously in all areas of life. Choosing a romantic partner in an era of dating apps means navigating among hundreds of potential options, knowing that both you and the other person have constant access to seemingly better alternatives. Forming a personal identity means choosing among thousands of digital influencers, belief systems, and lifestyles competing for your attention on social media. Even deciding what to eat has become a complex political and moral statement involving considerations about environmental sustainability, animal rights, personal health, and social justice. Our great-grandparents made these choices based on tradition, geography, and social class. Options were limited, but this also meant decisions were simpler and came with community support structures that validated those choices. We have almost infinite freedom of choice, but also almost infinite responsibility for the consequences of those choices, and much less social support to navigate through this complexity. The result is that each individual becomes a perpetual self-development project, constantly questioning whether they're making the right choices, whether they're adequately optimizing their life, whether they're missing better opportunities. Life becomes an infinite series of decisions that need to be constantly re-evaluated and adjusted. It's no coincidence that the word burnout has become so central in contemporary vocabulary. We're not just exhausted from work, we're exhausted from having to constantly be the curators of our own lives. Here enters a crucial aspect that's rarely discussed. Digital technology isn't just changing how we do things. It's fundamentally changing how we experience time and attention. Our brains are being constantly stimulated by notifications, updates, and new content. The capacity to simply be present in a moment without trying to optimize it or document it or compare it with other people's experiences online is becoming increasingly rare. This creates a strange form of temporal alienation. We live simultaneously in the future, constantly planning our next optimization or upgrade, and in the past, constantly consuming content about nostalgia, or comparing our present with idealized versions of how things used to be. The real present, where human life actually happens, becomes increasingly difficult to access. And when we manage to access it, we often discover we no longer know what to do with it. How many times have you had a few free minutes and immediately picked up your phone, not because you had something specific to do, but because the silence of your own mind had become uncomfortable? We are losing the capacity to be alone with our own thoughts, and consequently losing access to the psychological processes we traditionally used to process difficult experiences and integrate learnings about ourselves. The 2026 crisis won't just be about individuals feeling lost. It will be about the collapse of collective systems that used to help people process emotional difficulties. Traditional institutions of psychological support, extended family, religious communities, local associations, even stable workplaces where people developed lasting relationships, are being rapidly replaced by more superficial and transitory digital connections